Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Secrets on How to Fix a Flat. This is the third in a series of biking webinars focused on transportation and commuting options presented by Transaction Associates. My name is Courtney Goldberg, and I'm a program manager at Transaction Associates and the moderator of today's webinar. Joining me are my colleagues Kelly Marsacci and Sophia Gallimore, who will be assisting in the facilitation of our webinar. If this is your first time joining one of our webinars, Transaction Associates is a full-service transportation consulting company based in Woburn. We operate regional groups called TMAs, or Transportation Management Associations, and work with individual clients to manage their on-site transportation programs. Everything we do is centered around decreasing traffic congestion and improving air quality by reducing the number of people who drive alone. We also have a division of our company that operates shuttle services. Today, you will hear from Galen Mook, the Executive Director of MassBike and your statewide bicycle advocacy organization. Before taking the helm at MassBike, Galen worked at Landry's Bicycles for 5 years and helped to start up the Hubway bike share company, now known as Blue Bikes. Though he does work on an abundance of issues, including policies, legislations, funding concerns, education, and more, Galen particularly enjoys working towards conveying the basics of biking, which includes how to keep your bike running safely. This webinar will add on to what we learned in our previous biking webinars with Galen, the ABCs of bike maintenance, and the beginner's guide to everyday biking basics. By the end of this session, you'll be an expert on how to change a flat tire and address many of the common fixes needed for your bike maintenance. We hope this webinar will give you confidence to bike feeling empowered and take your rides safely into your hands. Before getting started, just a few housekeeping items. Throughout the webinar, we welcome your questions. Please use the chat or questions on the sidebar of your screen. We will try to answer all of your questions during the webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording that we hope you will share with others or watch again at a later date. There will also be a short survey in the email that we hope you will complete. So let's get started. Take it away, Galen.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney, and Sophia and Kelly. Thanks so much for Transaction for hosting me. Just a real quick preface that there are a ton of resources out there that you can follow up with. We did do a webinar on the air, brakes, and chain, the basics of the ABCs of making sure that your bike is safe to ride pretty much every time before you go to do the ABC check. And we'll cover today the most common problem that causes people to have to walk home, which is getting a flat tire. And chances are there'll be a hole in the inner tube and the air will leak out. So we'll cover how to change some of that. And before I get going too much, I do want to also mention that I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can get this going. And you'll see on the screen a great resource called eCommuter, which is a plug here for you to follow up if you are looking for a bike buddy, if you are looking for a good route to ride, not just to and from work, but maybe around town to run errands or even get some exercise and fitness, and more resources here about the shuttles and some other the commuter programs that Transaction hosts. So before I forget, I wanted to make a plug for eCommuter. And this is just one of the plethora of resources that we'll be covering today. So I'll come back to me, and great. So I also encourage you to chime in on the chat if you're having trouble hearing or having trouble seeing. Please let me know, because I will keep an eye on it, and I'll ask the moderators to also feel free to interject at any time. We will have a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to try to make this concise so that we wrap up with a good bit of Q&A. So maybe in about 45 minutes or so, we'll be able to cover the changing of a tire and a tube system in the bike. But again, feel free to derail me if there is anything specific, particularly to your bike, that you want to bring up. I also encourage you to follow along at home. If you've got your bike, or if you want to take a minute and go grab your bike, that's totally fine. And perhaps what you'll also need are a set of tire levers. So here's an example of a tire lever. Here's some more tire levers, because this will actually allow you to get access to the tires and the tubes. And I'll want you to have a good floor pump. This is a nice air pump. And if you don't have a floor pump, which I would recommend, it makes life a lot easier, you can also grab a portable pump. And we'll be covering all of these tools and tricks of the trade as well. But that's pretty much the equipment that's needed today. If you wanted to have a spare tube, we can cover some of the ins and outs of the sizing and the different parts of the tube, like the valve, the diameter, and the width, and the type of tube. It's always good to have a spare tube or two at home if you're going to get familiar with changing your own tires and tubes. And I don't have a spare tire that we're going to change today, although I do have some diagrams to show you on the makeup of a tire. But we're going to mostly focus on changing the inner tube. But we will talk about tire wear and tire tear so that you'll be able to diagnose your tires as when they're getting worn out. You'll be able to know when to change them. So we're going to just get going in a second, but I want to ask one poll question. Thanks to Kelly for prompting us here. Who is doing this live with us with your bike at home? I'm curious to know who's following along. So please take a minute to fill out this poll, and we'll get going right afterwards.
Absolutely. So who is tuning up their bike with us on this webinar? Please select from the following: yes, I am, I will during the recording after, or no, I'm only here to watch and learn. We'll leave this poll open for about 20 seconds or so. Let everyone get their answers in. All right, looks like the votes are slowing down. So we'll go ahead and close this and share our results.
Great.
So it looks like most of you are here just to watch and learn, and that some of you are planning to do this with the recording afterwards.
Great. Well, that's very good to know. So I won't worry about anybody getting stuck if they're doing it alone. So trying to see, lost my screen, my apologies here. There we go. Am I back?
You are. Looks great, Caleb.
Okay, great. Getting familiar with all these kludgy softwares. All right. So great. I'm glad that you are here to follow along. And again, my bike will be a little bit different than your bike. So if there are any snags that you have when you are doing this on your own, I also recommend getting in touch with a local bike shop. MassBike advocated pretty strongly to make sure that bike repair was considered an essential service during the COVID shutdown. So bike shops should be running. There might be some specific protocols to make sure that customers and staff aren't really interacting personally, but chances are your local bike shop is around. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to give them a call, give them an email, or set up a time to swing on by with your bike, because they can diagnose some of the nuances of how your bike works. All right, so the way that we're going to go today is I'll demonstrate on two different bikes, but primarily I'll be using my mountain bike, but I also have a road bike to showcase as well. We'll talk about taking off the wheel from the bike, because that's also very challenging. We'll talk about deflating the tire and tube, taking off the tire and tube and diagnosing where the flat may have occurred and why it might have occurred. Then from the symptomatic side, we'll be able to look to solve the problem. Then we'll put the tire and tube system back together, put the wheel back on the bike, and hopefully we'll be able to roll. And I do want to preface this by saying that though I'm going to share a lot of tips that will help you along the way, the best way to get familiar with changing out your tires and tubes, especially if you're going to be doing it on the side of the road during a ride, is to practice, practice, practice. Do this 20 times in a row in your garage or in your basement or wherever your bike room might be. And once you get familiar with how your bike works, then you'll have a much easier time doing this in the wild. It's very hard to figure out some of the ins and outs when you're in the middle of a ride, when you've already got the stress, when you're kind of bummed out because you got a flat tire and you might be avoiding the pack or have been dropped by the riders that you're with. So get familiar with this in a safe and comfortable, controlled environment so that when you have to do it out in the world, you'll already have that experience under your belt. All right. I'm actually going to start. I forgot to mention that another piece of equipment I'm going to have with me is gloves. These are optional, I would say, but I'm going to put them on just for the sake that I am in my laundry room in my basement, which means I have access to gloves. They're nice to have in your riding kit if you do want to bring them along, but just to make sure I'm doing my due diligence when I'm out on a ride. These days, I do bring a pair of gloves or maybe even a few pair of gloves along with a face covering or a mask, because general best practices during the time of COVID is to find barriers between you and the surfaces out in the world. So I'll put on my gloves and we'll go from there. Okay, let's get started. So I have right here my mountain bike. Let me showcase this bike a little bit. This is a bike which arguably might not be like yours. It has hand brakes that are at a horizontal position. Yours might be more vertical if you have a road bike. These tires are very wide, you'll see. So they're actually pretty easy to manipulate. The width of the tire will change how much pressure it deserves or it should have, and how easy or hard it is actually to remove from the wheel. You'll see that on my bike, I've got a full gear system right down here in the rear. So I'm gonna have to manipulate that once I am taking the wheel on and off, especially if it's the rear wheel. Don't need to worry about it with the front wheel. And it's a little hard to see in my confined area. Let me show you the quick release lever, which is right here, which is a lever that holds the wheel on the bike. Now, your bike might be different, but all of these things are good to diagnose and know how your bike works. Do you have quick release levers? Do you have full gear system in the rear? How wide are your tires and your wheels and all of that? Because once you get to know your bike, you'll know the parts that need to be checked regularly and these specifics on how to change and replace the parts when they wear out. Every part of a bike does wear out at some time. The only thing that doesn't get replaced on a bike eventually is the frame itself, but you'll get a new seat eventually, you'll get new cabling, your brake pads will wear out. It's common, it's normal. It's actually encouraged at a bike shop because that means you're riding your bike. But the thing that wears out the most generally is the tires from the rubber, just wear of the friction, and the inner tubes. And we'll talk a little bit about why the wear and tear happens there. So this is my mountain bike. I'm also going to show you a road bike. This is my partner's road bike. Differences and nuances between, or with this bike, are the wheels are much thinner. You can see these are higher pressure, much thinner wheels. The brake lever system is a vertical system. It's still cable, but it's vertical cable, and so it's drop down handlebars. This bike does have a quick release lever. You can see right here. This, when it's secured, holds the wheel on, or if I open it up, I can take the wheel off the bike. And it does have a full set of gear systems in the rear as well. So all these things I'm going to need to know about. Now, your bike will have other things that are different. Sizing, does it have water bottle cages, does it have lights, and all the other things. The things that we really need to focus on when we're taking wheels on and off and messing with the tires and tubes are the braking system, because we're going to need to unhook or at least quick release open the brake, how the wheel is actually attached to the bike, if it's a quick release lever, or do you need to get a wrench and actually unscrew the bolt on the wheel, and how to manipulate the gearing system so that the gears get out of the way so that we can go ahead and grab our wheel and remove it from the bike. So in the interest of time, because I don't want to take too long, I'm actually just going to manipulate my mountain bike, but I will mention a few things about the road bike before I do it. So the first thing that we're going to have to do in order to take the wheel on or off the bike is open up the brakes. And opening up the brakes is typically done through a quick release lever that is somewhere along your braking system. So we talked a little bit about the barrel adjusters and how the braking system works during the ABC clinic. It's important now because you'll find generally somewhere along the braking system, there'll be a lever that you can manipulate, which also allows you to open the brakes. And you can watch here as I kind of take this downturn knob and I open it up, that my brakes actually open just a hair. That might be hard to see on the virtual zoom, but it's about a centimeter or a centimeter and a half that just pivots the bolt that holds the cable system in. And now my brakes are tighter, and now my brakes are open. It's very important to know how your brakes are actually flowing through the cable system, and if you have a quick release lever. We'll show you the difference on my mountain bike in a second, but if you have a road bike at home, chances are somewhere along the line, specifically probably right at the brake itself, there'll be a lever for you to manipulate. Again, no tools needed. I'm just using my hands to open it up, and now my brakes are slightly wider. And what this is doing is just letting out the cable a little bit without actually changing how it's secured. It's just a little pivoting system. And what this does, though, it allows me to pull the wheel completely out of the frame without the tire, and the width of the tire is a little bit wider than the rim itself. It allows me to remove the wheel, even with an inflated tire, without needing to take air out of the tire or have the brakes get kind of banged up is the wrong word, but maybe moved around and knocked out of position. So again, find the quick release lever. Also important to know when the brakes are open in the quick release that your braking power is not as strong. And when I hit my brakes, I'm actually have a really loose cable. So if you're noticing that your cable feels really loose and you can almost pull the brake lever all the way to the handlebar, what you should check first is, are my quick release levers open? And if they are, go ahead and close it. And chances are that'll solve the problem and your brakes will lock out much more securely. Now, one thing to note though, is you don't want your brakes to be too tight. So if you're ever manipulating your brakes to make them looser or tighter, go ahead and double check there's no rub by giving the wheel a good spin and making sure there is no rub. Sometimes brakes get out of whack. It's normal. We talked a little bit about this on the B of the ABCs of bike maintenance. If that's ever the case and you can't diagnose it and fix it yourself, take it to the bike shop because there are certain things you don't want to mess with, and being able to stop securely is one of them. So again, find the quick release lever and being able to manipulate it. I'm going to put my road bike away, but if there are any road bike specific questions, please do let me know. Okay. So again, getting to my mountain bike. The reason I use this one is just because it's just a little bit bigger and easier to see. So let's go through the, I guess, the made up situation where you're riding your bike, get a flat tire, and you're kind of stranded out there. I'm actually going to demonstrate on my rear wheel because it's the more difficult wheel to remove. But before I do that, I'm going to showcase the quick release on my brakes on my front wheel for a comparison. So you'll see here, oh, it's actually removed. The cable itself, I must have done this when I was in practice mode yesterday. The way that, and let's see if I can maybe move my light to make it a little bit more visible. And again, if you can't see, please do let us know in the chat. You'll see how the cable pull system on my mountain bike actually comes down to a point where I can fold the brake in a little bit, pop out the cable, and that's my quick release for my brake system on my mountain bike. And you can see now that the brakes are very wide and very open, which means that I can pull the wheel completely off the bike without having the brake pads or the tire get in the way. So the idea of the brakes, the quick release levers on my mountain bikes are totally different than the quick release levers on the road bike. And you should know how your bike functions. Again, with this one, it's the cable itself that actually gets removed. Now the cable head doesn't come out, but it's just how this bike is built, where if I put the cable back in, now my brakes are attached. I always want to check it. Always want to do a roll to make sure my brakes are on. And then when I'm removing my wheel, I'm going to manipulate the cable, pop it out, and now my quick release is open. So point of comparison there. I'm going to take a quick break before I do this, and before I jump right into the wheels, I'm going to, maybe I'll ask Kelly to do our second poll of the time, which is, have you ever changed your own tires and tubes before?
So again, the question is, have you ever changed your own tires and tubes before? Select one of the following. Yes, I'm pretty good at it. I tried, but I didn't work out too well. Nope, but I want to learn. And nope, that's what my bike shop is for. So again, we'll leave this open for about 20 seconds or so. Let everyone get their votes in. Okay. All right, I'm going to close the poll. So any last minute votes, get them in now. All right. So it looks like nope, but I want to learn is the top winner with 56%. And then I tried, but it didn't work out too well in second place. And then tied for yes, I'm pretty good at it. And nope, that's what my bike shop is for.
I love it. This is a good one. So I really appreciate those of you who tried and weren't that good at it. It took me a good, I don't know, a couple hundred times until I felt like I was very proficient at it, and then let alone being able to explain it in a way to teach it. So don't get discouraged when you're out there, just keep at it. And again, if you do it 20 times in a row in your garage, chances are you'll be a pro once you actually need it out in the wild. Okay, thank you for that intel. So I'll know how I'll be referencing as we go forward. Cool. So here is my mountain bike, and let me again show you. I've got the gearing system, I've got the braking system. I actually do have air in this tire, but I'll show you how to deflate it in a second. But the first thing that I'll need to do in order to remove the wheel is first, I'm going to open up the brakes, and I'll do it the same here, just like I did on my front brake, where I can manipulate the cable, and I pull the cable out, and now my brakes are open up. So just like I did on the front, and I showed you in the front because it was easier to show you, I did that on the rear, and now I do not have functional brakes in the rear because I've unlatched them. Second thing I'm going to do is make sure the chain is as much out of the way as possible. If you have a bike with a gearing system like I do, chances are you have rear gears and front gears. And the rear gears function so that when you're in more incremental changes, it just changes the resistance harder or easier to pedal, which changes basically the gear ratio. And that's a whole other hour-long webinar I'm going to go to there. But the be all end all for what you need to know is try to get the chain as far out away from the frame as possible. And by that, I mean, it should be on the rear wheel, try to get the chain to the furthest out, which is the hardest gear. And on the front, sorry about that. It'll be the furthest out from the front, which is the hardest gear as well. Now it's the biggest cog in the front and it's the smallest cog in the rear. Not gonna worry about that right now, but the idea of trying to shift and pedal so the chain is as far out as possible. And I'll show you why in a second. If I am pulling my chain as far out, I'm gonna shift and then I'm gonna pedal. And you'll see that even when I shift, I still do need to pedal in order for the chain to actually move. You'll see that my derailleur starts to chill out. And by the derailleur, I mean this component of the bike right here. And it's kind of got a lot of give that it could still do. So there's still some movement that it's allowed. It's not under the full strain. Whereas if I were to shift to a gear that's more in the rear, you'll see that my derailleur, this arm right here, is under a lot of stretch. It's under a lot of pull, which means there's a lot of potential energy just sitting in that derailleur. So when I pull my wheel off, it snaps on me. So the idea, not to break, but just kind of it's harder to manipulate. So the idea of watching this arm on the derailleur, when I pedal in the rear to the furthest out gear, you can watch this derailleur arm as my chain kind of goes through the motions, kind of start to relax. And that's my first tip, is to try to get the chain as much out of the way as possible, which for most bikes, it's actually moving it to the hardest gear, specifically in the rear, so that you are not putting that much strain on your derailleur arm. So once your brakes are unhooked, once your chain is as far out as possible, when the derailleur is hanging out, I'm actually going to flip my bike upside down, which I don't necessarily recommend too much. Let me just make this here. But the reason I do this is just for demonstration purposes. It's easier to show. The reason I don't flip my bike upside down too often is because in the front, that's where my cockpit is. That's where my steering is. That's where my brakes are. That's where my shifting is. It's all pretty sensitive, and I don't want to mess anything up. So, but give or take, if you're on the side of the road and it's just so frustrating that, especially if you take off a rear wheel because you're going to have all this gear system that's exposed, flipping it over, just be wary. Some people put a towel down or make sure it's putting it down in grass, but just be careful once you're flipping your bike upside down. All right, that said, chain's as far out of the way, brakes are unhooked. I'm gonna have to go to my quick release lever and undo my quick release lever. And on this lever, it's even kind of curved. You can almost see it's kind of like a spoon, where when it's closed, I use my palm to push it in, and I'll use my thumbs to open it up. And once it's open, my wheel is loose. Now, we covered this a little bit on the ABCs. You need to make sure that the lever is closed, and now my wheel is fixed in the frame pretty securely. When it's open, you can hear and even see my wheel be able to bounce around. Now, that said, that's what we're looking for right now, because we're going to be removing the wheel. So I will keep my quick release lever open. And what I'm going to do is grab very gently the derailleur. The derailleur system is where the chain flows through, as I said, on the gears in the rear. I'm going to move it gently out of the way so that my axle has a clear shot to be pulled out. And then I'm going to remove my wheel just like that. Now, I made this look easy. If you've never taken your rear wheel off before, it's pretty darn tricky, because look at the derailleur right now. It's kind of folded in on itself. It doesn't look anything like it does when you actually got a wheel in there and there's actually some tension on it. Without any tension, the whole thing kind of collapses on itself, and it's easy to kind of forget how the chain and the gears and the wheel all interface. So if you're unfamiliar with taking a rear wheel off, I'll do it one more demonstration for you. You'll see that when it's collapsed, what I'm gonna do is kind of pull the derailleur a little bit out of the way to make a clear shot. I'm gonna make sure that the gear cluster goes in between the two sections of chain, and then I'm gonna target it to slide right in. And now you see it looks normal, especially if I can kind of make sure it locks into place in the axle and I close my quick release. Now my wheel is back on. If this is new to you, one of my tips is before you go about to remove the rear wheel, just grab your phone and take a picture of this system so you'll see how it looks, so that you know what you're targeting once you put it back in. And then you'll have a guidepost. Otherwise, and trust me, I've been there. When I was first new to this, I was like, how the heck does this work? And it's very easy to get kind of tangled in yourself. So take a photo, know what your derailleur system should look like before you take the whole thing apart. But that said, I'll do it one more time, where I'll move the derailleur a little bit out of the way. Here's my axle. My axle is gonna have a clear shot to leave the bike. I'm gonna kind of just make sure the chain isn't there, and boom, there we go. Got the rear wheel, and here's the whole rest of the bike. All right, so that said, I'm gonna pause for a second and see if there are any questions that are coming in on the chat, and if not, we'll just keep barreling through.
It looks pretty good, Galen. Everyone's right along with us.
Great, appreciate that. Excellent. All right, so the reason I spend a lot of time on this is because, again, it's really kind of the most frustrating part sometimes is putting the rear wheel on and off. But if you do get any snags, feel free to let me know and let your bike shop know. All right, so wheels off. We're gonna kind of move my bike out of the way, out of the frame, because we are no longer in need of the rest of this. What we're gonna be focusing on now is the wheel. So you'll see about the rear wheel. This, of course, is my mountain bike, much wider tires than a road bike. It's got knobs on it. It's actually gonna be pretty easy to pull on and off the rim because there's so much surface to play around with. I'm gonna make this look very easy. If you've got a road bike, especially one with really thin tires at high pressure, you're gonna struggle a little bit, especially if it's a new tire and hasn't gotten a little bit of give to it yet. But that said, keep at it and don't give up. All right, so we pulled off the wheel. Now this wheel still has air in it, and if you were having a flat tire, well, I mean, you wouldn't need to worry about that. But the first thing we're gonna have to do here is deflate this tire. Now what is happening inside of here is there's the tire, which is the outer casing, which is the hard rubber, and inside of that is a pneumatic tube, which is what takes the air. You access the tube through this valve, and you'll see there's only one valve throughout the rim. This is probably rudimentary for a lot of you, but let's just cover it. So what's going on is there's a two-part system. There's the outer casing of the hard or the more firm rubber for the tire, and then inside for the inner tube. Chances are the inner tube is what's failing, and there's probably a leak within the inner tube. If there's actually a hole on the tire, and maybe the inner tube inside of here maybe blew out the side of a tire, or there's a chunk of the tire that got worn down, or there's a big piece of glass or rock or something, then we'll have to kind of manipulate the tire, maybe even change the tire. But most flats are caused by just a puncture of the inner tube. And then once we solve that problem and maybe remove the small piece of debris from the outer tire, you just need to replace the inner tube and the tire is fine. However, in a second, I will showcase some common problems with the tire itself starts to wear down. Couple things to know about the inner tube is that there's a couple of ways, really just two, of putting air inside of the tire. And I covered this at the ABC, so I don't want to go too much into it, but you should know that there are two different valve systems. There's a Presta valve, which is like this one here. And then there's a Schrader valve system, which kind of looks a little bit fatter, like a car tire valve system. And I'll pull these pretty close. These are the two different types of valves. One is called Presta and one is called Schrader. Now, they actually operate a little bit differently. You can see on the inside of the Schrader one, there's actually a little piece of metal that deplunges or depresses in there, and there's a gasket that is the seal. And so you need maybe an object or a side of a tire lever or a set of keys or something to kind of get into it, to press it to release the air. Where the Presta valve actually has a tip, a little brass tip that you'll see if I unscrew here. And now this is open. Now I can access the valve by unscrewing the tip. And then when I want to seal the valve, what I got to do is screw that tip back down. And now you'll see that I can't actually get at the valve, and it's stuck and it's sealed with this little knurled brass tip. So two different valve systems, and it's important to know which one your bike takes. Notice that there are two different widths. The Schrader is much wider, so it's made for wider wheels. Wider wheels are used for hybrid bikes or mountain bikes, fatter tires so that you can dig into the dirt and the ground, and you can kind of do a little bit more off-roading. Whereas thinner wheels, which would take the Presta style, really are made for road. And the reason is the thinner the wheel, the thinner the tire, which means the less amount of friction when you're rolling on the roads. So though this is, and my apologies, I'm going to kind of contradict myself, though this is a mountain bike wheel with a mountain bike tire, which is quite wide, I've actually manipulated it to have a Presta valve. So I'm actually not really supposed to have a Presta valve in this wheel because it's made for Schrader. The reason I'm doing that, though, is for demonstration purposes so that we can do it for this class. If the danger, it's not real danger, but it's the concern about putting a Presta valve in a Schrader-sized rim is that the hole for the valve is a little bit wider than the valve itself. So there's a little bit of a gap, which is a little hard to see, but if I get this lock screw out of the way, it's not quite a perfect seal, and I can actually wiggle the valve around a little bit, which is not ideal because it runs the risk of the rubber that the valve attaches to actually tearing against the side of the rim. So keep in mind, whatever valve your bike has, to maintain that style valve, whether it to be Schrader, the bigger one, or Presta, the skinnier one. And again, with Presta, the way it works is by unscrewing this tip. Now I can start to deflate my tire. All right. Now you'll see my tire is going flat. Can't ride on a flat tire. All right. So here we go. Open valve, empty tube, soft tire. Now I can start to play around with it. So you got a flat tire. Say you've already removed the wheel. This is the stage that we're at right now. You can see it's totally flat. All right. So now we're going to grab our tools. Primarily what you're going to use are tire levers, and they come in groups because you'll need two of them. I have two different styles here. I have a thinner style, which is made by Park Tools, and kind of a fatter style, which is made by Pedros. Doesn't really quite matter, although I prefer personally the Pedros ones because there's more surface area to play with, easier to bend. But you'll see that their similarities are the same of just both have a scoopy end, this side, and both have kind of a hook side, this side, and I'll show you why. So say you got your flat tire. First thing you're going to want to do is just to give it a once over to see if there's anything like major sticking out of the tire itself. What's going on? Is there a piece of glass that's still in there? Is there a giant staple? I've had a friend who ran over a screwdriver once, and literally the screwdriver went into the tire and they're kind of stuck. Just to know like how bad the extent of it is. Chances are it's just a leak and you got a flat, and so we'll diagnose from the inside. But first, take a look at the exterior. First step to get at the tire is to remove it. So we have to get at the tube, we have to remove the tire. So I'm going to, let me see if I can position myself a little bit better here. What I'm going to do is find where the valve is and actually start opposite the valve. And the reason for that is because I'm going to be bending and folding, and I want to make sure that I'm not damaging the valve itself. So I'm going to take the scoopy side. I'm going to kind of pull the tire and wiggle it so that it separates from the rim. I'm going to take the scoopy side of the tire lever. I'm going to find probably a spoke, maybe this spoke, which because it's further out. I'm going to pull my tire back, grab what's called the tire bead, flip my tire lever over, and then with the locking end, lock it into a spoke. And you can see here that my tire is just a little bit folded over the rim. I'm going to go a few inches out and do the same. Maybe do one spoke, pull the tire back with my hands, find the tire lever, lock it into what's called the bead, I'll talk about it in a second, and fold it over like that. And you'll see I have a swath of tire, maybe 3 or 4 or 6 inches, that's fully over the rim. The other side of the tire is fully in the rim. I'm not going to manipulate or mess with that. I'm just going to be worried about the one side of pulling the tire over the rim itself. And again, starting opposite the valve so that I don't run the risk of kind of damaging the valve. Once I've got a good section already off the rim, I'm going to take my tire lever and slide it all the way around. And at this point, I might even just be able to use my hands. And I've opened up my tire, and you can see on the inside of here is my inner tube. Again, this side of the rim is still fully in. It's really only this side of the rim and this side of the wheel that I'm pulling my tire off. So I've opened up my tire. And at this point, I'm probably going to let it flat, so I'm not fighting gravity. And I'm going to probably starting, here's the valve. I'm going to start kind of opposite the valve, just kind of gently pulling the inner tube out of the tire. And then when I get to my valve, which is right here, I'm going to be very careful to fold my tire so that I've got a straight shot of the valve to come completely out of the valve hole. A couple things I want to show you. The valve hole, you can see right here, it's this gap in, it's a little hard to see, but it's right here. It's the gap in the rim. And that is pretty, sharp isn't the right word, but it's a delicate spot to be yanking your valve in and out of. So whenever you're removing or inserting your valve, just be careful. So again, half the tire out, pulled out the tube. Here's my floppy tube. I'm going to try not to change the orientation of my tire as it's sitting in the wheel. And I'll talk about it in a second, mainly because I want to keep the spot where the valve is consistent with that spot in the tire, so that when I find the hole in my tube, I know where it is in relation to my valve, and I can more specifically diagnose where I'm going to triple check and quadruple check my tire for any debris. So far so good. I know I made it look easy. Tire lever, swing all the way around, pull one half of the tire off of the rim, dig in there, gently start to yank the tube carefully out of the tire system. And then once you get to the valve, kind of fold the tire back and slide it out, and boom, there you go. Now, at this part of the demonstration, you're going to need your second tool, which is a pump. Now, I'm going to use a floor pump because it's easy. If you only have a hand pump for travel, it's just going to take a lot more pumping, but it's the same principle. You got to put air in the tube in order to find out where the hole is. This is just a symptomatic way of checking things. Now, one thing about my pump, which I talked about at the last webinar as well, is that there's 2 different holes, one for Schrader and one for Presta. And I got to know how my pump works. This pump, as I carry it on my pack, I actually can do both Presta and Schrader, but I need to actually unscrew the tip of the pump and reverse the innards in order to make it either a Schrader or a Presta. And you should know how your pump works based off either valve. If you've got a Presta valve, make sure your pump is set to Presta. If you got a Schrader valve, make sure your pump is set to Schrader. This pump, though, has both options. So I'm just going to need to know that I'm going to find the Presta size, which is the smaller one on the bottom, and I'll insert it into my tube. And you'll see that as I pump, my tube starts to take shape and become, with a little bit of gentle guidance, I hope, starts to become three-dimensional. As an inside and outside, a top side, a bottom side, and sides. I'm going to put a good amount of pumps in, maybe like 5 or 10 pumps on a floor pump, so it's probably like 20 to 30 pumps on a hand pump, so that I've got enough air in my inner tube that there's pressure, so where the hole is, I'm going to actually be able to feel it or even hear it. This is important because you're going to want to know where on your tube the air is leaking out of. If the air is leaking out of the outside, chances are a piece of debris made its way through the tire, and it might still be in the tire, and it made its way and bored a hole through the tube. If you've got holes on the sides, especially if they're two holes, we call it a pinch flat, a snake bite flat. What happens is the tube is very soft and it will squeeze and pinch against the rim, and you'll get two holes, either two holes on one side or one hole on either side, because what happens is the tube compresses and pinches against the rim. That's a pinch flat. And the reason for that is basically under inflation. Or you can get a hole in the interior of the tube, which means that there's something wrong with the rim and the rim strip. If I can pull this out of the way, you can kind of see there's a inside of the rim. Sometimes this rim strip starts to wear out. And if you've got a hole in the interior of your three-dimensional tube, you'll need to check why by looking and diagnosing the rim itself. So again, 3 different major ways that flats happen. You get a piece of debris from the exterior that bores its way through the rubber and makes its way to the outside of the tube. You'll get a pinch flat where the tube itself squeezes because the tire just has a little bit too much give because there's not enough air in it. Chances are there's no debris or anything to fix. It's just an inflation problem. Or the interior of the tube. And if you've got that as a problem, you'll need to check the rim and the rim strip to make sure that there's nothing sharp. Sometimes the rim strip wears out. You can replace it from a bike shop. You can purchase rim strip. You can also use electrical tape just as a rung in there, but you'll need to get a rim strip. And I'll show you here that this rim strip is black, as you see. And the reason that you need a good rim strip is that because each of these spokes, as they come into the rim, creates a little bit of a gap. And if this rim strip wasn't here, the tube would get sucked into that little bit of a gap where the spoke meets the rim, and you'll get a puncture in the tube. So you need to have functional rim strip. Okay, so air in the tube, let's find out where the hole is. Sometimes it's hard to hear it. Sometimes it's hard to feel it, especially if you're on the side of the road and busy traffic. So one thing I like to do is actually kind of like lick my lips and see if I can feel it on your lips, because you have a lot of nerve endings there. And you might be able to feel it more on your face or on your lips before you can feel it on your hands, especially if you've been wearing gloves and your hands are all grimy. But that said, whatever you can do, you got to put a little bit of air in to find out where the hole is at. So you found the hole. Let's say it's on the exterior. Let's say it's on the exterior and you found it and it's right here. Now, if this was in a class and we were in person and this wasn't just me talking at a computer, I'd actually have some examples of tubes with holes in them, and I'd pump this up and I'd pass it around and I'd ask you to feel it. Chances are you run your hand over and you feel the escaping air and you say, oh, about 12 inches from the valve, I'm going to need to find 12 inches from the, let's see if I can show you the valve hole. It's a little hard to see. I need 12 inches from the valve hole. I'm going to be extra vigilant to see if there's a piece of debris still in my tire. And what I'll do is I'll run my hands on the inside of the tire, or maybe I'll have a cloth. Sometimes I'll bring up a cloth or a rag. So if there's any sharp staples or something, it won't snag. And I'll be able to feel what's going on. And if it's there, I'll just need to kind of pluck it out and remove the debris. You have to remove the debris before you're able to replace the tube. I'm going to share my screen real quick and show you two other, let's see if we can do.
Hey, Galen,
Yeah.
can I ask you a question?
Oh, of course,
So,
please.
a question came in that says, when removing the tire, does it matter which side of the wheel you remove the wheel rim?
Excellent question. No, in my opinion, no. Different people have different preferences, but it's the same on both sides. Okay.
Thank you, Galen.
You're welcome. Can you see the screen with the tire? I'm wondering if I'm sharing my screen or not.
Yes.
Yep, we can
yes,
see
you
you.
are.
Okay, so right here, you'll see a couple other things to be wary of. So other reasons that you can get a flat tire besides a piece of debris, the tire itself can wear out. So this is an example of what we call tire wear, where the threading of the tire actually starts to break through. I'll show you. These are wear indicators that some tires have, and they are actually supposed to be in a tire that you're supposed to see them. But if you've worn down your tire so much that you can't see these wear indicators, then it's time to replace your tire. And this is mainly for road bikes. Or you'll see here, this is a worn out tire. This is a good example of what we call dry rot, where the rubber starts to crack, and you'll see pieces of it start to chip and flake away. So keep an eye on your tires as a diagnostic, and if the tires start to wear out, you'll need to replace them. My last shot here, this is the makeup of the tire. So I want you to pay attention to the casing, the fact that there's tread on the outside, but in the interior, the casing is actually really thin, and chances are it's made with a little bit of Kevlar and a little bit of threading. And then pay attention to the bottom part called the bead. And the bead is what we're going to talk about in a second when I put my tire back into, put my tube back in the tire. So again, we have the bead, which is the spot that actually locks into the rim. And sometimes they're made of steel or thick Kevlar. Then you have the cross hatching of the threading, and then the kind of the layers of rubber. Okay, it's all making sense?
Yep, looks great, Galen.
Okay, let's get back to me. Can you see me back? I think so. Great.
Yep.
All right, so we discovered where on the tube the hole is, hypothetically. We've discovered why the hole happened. Maybe it's a piece of debris that we've removed. Maybe it's a piece of rim strip that we've replaced, or maybe it's a whole new tire that we'll need to get. Now we're going to kind of put the system back into place. A couple of things that I'd recommend. You can worry about patch kits. Patch kits are ways of putting rubber back onto a tire. I'm not going to do a demonstration of a patch kit because it doesn't really make much sense to do virtually, but the way it works, just so you're aware, is that this is not a Band-Aid of sorts. This is actually a piece of rubber, and this is not glue. This is a vulcanizing fluid. And what I mean there is that what happens when you apply the fluid to the rubber on the tube, it actually melts the tube a little bit, and then you put a piece of rubber on it and let it sit for about 5 minutes or maybe even 10 minutes, and it, as a chemical compound, rebuilds the rubber around the hole. And it's not a Band-Aid, it's actually kind of more tube that gets added to your tube. So just so you know that one option for fixing your flat is to mess with a patch kit. Now the trouble with patch kits though is that if you get a flat that is a pinch flat or it's a big flat that you can't patch, or I'm like a 9 out of 10 with my patching, so I don't even really trust it out there. I more or less rely on a brand new tube. Now, I carry a tube with me if I'm going to go for long distances in my pack, along with my tire levers and pump. But you'll see that the tube itself is pretty thin, especially when it's deflated. It doesn't have any form or shape to it. So we'll talk about kind of giving it shape with air and then reinserting it back into the tire system. Before you head out, though, you've got to make sure that the size of the tube, which is right here, this is 700 by 23 by 25, matches the size of your tire, which, let me see if I can find it right here. On this tire, you see it says 26 by 1.9. So the tire itself has a specific diameter and a specific width that you have to match. Not only are we matching the valve type, which this one is a Schrader, we're also going to match the size. The difference between this size, this is a 16 by 1 3/8. This is a 700 by 23 to 25. They're totally different size tubes. And neither of them are going to fit my 26 by 19 wheel. And this one too won't either. This is a 29 by 1.75 to 2.4. So the first number, you don't need to remember this too much, but the first number is the diameter and the second number is the width, but you need to match it. And I have 3 different varieties of tubes, which are not going to work for my bike. So you're going to need to make sure that you're matching it. So that said, I'm just going to use the same tube that I had before because it doesn't actually have any holes in it. However, in order to do this, and I'll make this quick because I realize that we're on our last 5 minutes here, you're going to want to put a little bit of air in the tire, but just a little bit. When you start with a very floppy tube, like this one here, you need to give it some structure, some 3-dimensionality. With a little bit of 3-dimensionality, with a little bit of pumping, you'll be able to insert it properly. And my rule is, when I'm holding it, if there's a little bit of creasing, but just a little bit, that's probably good, but I want to get that 3-dimensionality. I want the sides, the top, and the inside. I'm going to go back to this vantage point, and I'm going to basically reverse what we had done before in pulling it out. So the way that we did this, and I'll step you through this process as well, put a little bit of air in, give itself the 3-dimensionality, find the valve, which is right here, the valve hole in the rim, and just like we pulled the tire back to pull out the valve, we're going to do the same by pulling the tire back and putting the valve back in, and very gently just grabbing the tire with our hands and folding it over, and then you'll see that I'm just tucking the tube inside of the tire. Oh, and I'm reminded that there was a question that came up that Courtney asked me, is what happens if you have a tire that actually gets a hole, not just the tube itself. So if the tire has a hole, and it's not just a piece of glass or staple that you can pluck out, you can actually do what's called booding, where you take well, they make tire specific patches, but one thing you can take, which I don't necessarily have here, is a $1 bill. You can fold up a $1 bill and put it right on the inside of the tire where that hole is. And when you put the tube back in, just like we did here, and put a little pressure in, it creates enough structure to typically protect the hole in the tire casing. So a little bit of softness is needed, but you can actually fix a hole in the tire by doing what's called booting it, which could be done with a $1 bill. I've also seen people use the cardboard of tube boxes, or we had a scenario where somebody came in with a Nature Valley candy wrapper and actually put that in between the tire and the tube, just to create a little bit of structure so that the tube itself, which is the only thing that really needs air is the tube, didn't pop through the sidewall of the tire. Just a little bit of tangent. Thanks for letting me remind me of that. But that said, assuming that the tire is okay, assuming that we fixed the problem with the tube, again, what I've done is I've kind of inserted the tube and kind of scooted it in the back of the tire, and you'll see that it's still, I didn't remove it from this half. I'm only removing it from this half of the rim. And at this point, starting around the valve, which is right here, I'm literally just going to use my thumb and roll my tire bead, which is that structure of the tire I showed you on the diagram, and just kind of put it back in the rim. And you'll see what I'm doing is actually working my hands away from each other and having them meet on the far end. And the reason for that is so that if I just do one side, it starts to pop out around the edge. I'm going to want to squeeze equally on both ends. And if it becomes really tough at the edge because you just don't have a lot of give, at that point, I'll take a little bit of air out, just a little bit, and I'll try to fold this back in. And what I'm going to do here is literally just use my meat of my hands, or my thumb is, and roll it back into place, and roll it back into place. Now, once I've done that, I will make a good check, and you'll see that I popped my tire right back in. I made this look very easy. It's easy because I have wider tires, easy because I've done this a million times. Keep at it, and I don't recommend using a tool to fold that back in because you don't want to inadvertently pinch the tube inside there. Just use your hands and roll it in. Once the tire bead is locked back into place, do a quick check all around to make sure that no part of the tire or even the tube system is sticking out. Once you feel you're confident doing that, you just pump up your tire. You're going to want to pump it up to the recommended inflation pressure that's on the side of the tire. Typically, I'll start at the minimum and see if that's good, and then if it feels good, I'll put it up to the maximum. But with every pump, you should be aware that the pressure structure changes inside of the tire and the tube. So pump slowly and make sure that everything is working evenly. Once the tire is back on and the tube comes back onto shape, we're going to reinsert the tire back onto the wheel, just like I showed you in the beginning. But in the meantime, I'll pass off to Courtney to jump right in while I'm pumping up my tube. Are there any questions that I can address while we round out our lesson?
Thank you, Galen. That was awesome. I took a ton of notes. Hopefully others did as well, or they were able to follow along with their bikes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have any other questions.
Okay.
Nope, everything looks good. I do have a quick poll, just if anyone wanted to do that. Do you feel more confident now to change your own tires and tubes now having seen Galen's presentation? So we'll launch that just as our last quick poll.
Excellent.
So again,
and keep
do
in
you
mind
feel
the
more
last 90
confident?
seconds.
Oh,
the last 90 seconds of this is putting the wheel back on, which I demonstrated earlier. But yeah, pretty much this is the toughest part is over.
Again, we'll leave this open for about 20 seconds or so. Let everyone get their last votes in. All right, so we'll close this poll out. And it looks like 50% of you said, yes, I feel more confident now to change my own tires and tubes. And a couple of you said, I'll need to rewatch the recording a few more times.
Yeah, totally. So a couple of tips that may be helpful is just to watch in the beginning when I pull the wheel on and off a few times. That's going to be tricky, so get very familiar with that, especially if it's the front wheel, the back wheel, I mean, and make sure that your brakes go back on. And then once you're pumping up the tire, I'll mention this, is that check with a quick squeeze after you've pumped it up to make sure there's no bulging, make sure nothing has slipped off, and make sure that everything is nice and seated in the tire system. But typically I'll go to the minimum, which is recommended on the side of the tire, just to let it settle, give it a little bit of time, and then I'll go back up to the maximum. And you want to make sure that you're somewhere within that range so you prevent getting pinch flat. And keep an eye on the diagnostics of the wear and tear of your tires. And it really is just do it 20 times in a row, 20 times in a row, and you'll get it.
All right, Galen, thank you so much. And thank you to
Just
everyone
one
for
more quick
joining
question.
us.
One more
Oh,
quick
yes.
question, Courtney. Galen, how much air should you have in your tires?
Oh, good question. I covered this a little bit on the ABCs, but it'll be written on the side of the tire. And sometimes it's hard to see. Let me see if I can showcase on this sidewall of the tire. It says, very hard to see, but it'll say pressure right there, 35 to 65. And what I mean by that is that's the PSI, the pounds per square inch, but every tire is different. There's a lot written on the side of this tire, so find on the edge of your tire where it says the word pressure or it says the word PSI, but it will be on every tire. And every tire is different. A typical rule, kind of like now hard and fast. The hard and fast rule is check your tire, but I'll leave you with this right here of recommended inflation pressures for the types of bikes. You'll see that there's a range for most of them. Road bikes are much higher pressure and fatter tire bikes are much lower pressure. So one of the important things about having a good pump is having a trustworthy gauge that you believe in. And you can ride at whatever range you like on the higher or the lower end, but make sure you're within that range because that's what your tire is set to.
All right. Thanks again, Galen. Thank you so much for joining, and thanks to everyone for joining our third in a series of biking webinars, Secrets on How to Fix a Flat. Again, I'm Courtney Goldberg. If you have any questions about Transaction Associates or the services we provide, you can reach me at cgoldberg@transactionassociates.com. Thanks again, everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Transaction, for hosting. And feel free to keep in touch anytime. And thank you, Sophia. It's always good to see you.
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.